Imagine working tirelessly, feeling invisible, until one unexpected encounter turns everything around. That's exactly what happened when Clint Eastwood walked into a small-town hospital and met a dedicated nurse, Samantha. This story is not just about kindness, it's about hope, second chances, and the power of being seen. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered softly as Samantha adjusted her scrubs and checked the time. 1:47 a.m. The night shift at Rosewood Medical Center, a small-town hospital in Montana, was slow but steady. A few patients rested in their rooms, machines beeping in quiet rhythm, while the emergency room held only a handful of cases, none urgent. Samantha let out a quiet sigh, exhaustion weighing on her after another long shift. She had been here for almost 10 hours, tending to patients, filling out paperwork, and pushing through the fatigue that never seemed to fade. She ran a hand through her tired brown hair, already thinking about getting home to her 7-year-old son Jake, who was asleep under the watchful eye of her neighbor. It wasn't easy raising a child alone while working endless shifts, but she made it work. Medical school had once been the dream, but reality had forced her into the workforce sooner than planned. Being a nurse was rewarding, but it was also physically and emotionally draining, especially on nights like this. The automatic doors slid open, letting in a cold gust of Montana air. Samantha looked up from her chart, expecting another routine patient. Instead, a man walked in, his posture steady but slightly strained, his hand wrapped in a makeshift bandage. His face, partly shadowed under a well-worn hat, seemed familiar. Too familiar. Her breath caught. Clint Eastwood. Samantha blinked, forcing herself to stay professional. Celebrity or not, he was just another patient. Steeling herself, she grabbed a clipboard and walked toward him, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She had no idea that this night was about to change her life forever. Samantha approached the reception desk, clipboard in hand, her heartbeat steady despite the recognizable face in front of her. Clint Eastwood stood there, tall but slightly weary, his weathered hands resting against the counter. His hat was pulled low, but there was no mistaking those sharp, observant eyes, the same ones that had graced movie screens for decades. She had served plenty of patients before, some grateful, some irritable, most forgettable. This one, however, would be anything but. "Good evening, Mr. Eastwood," she said, keeping her voice professional. "What brings you in tonight?" He glanced down at his hand, wrapped in a rough bandage, then back at her. "Cut myself while hiking," he said simply, his voice as measured and iconic as she had heard in films. "Nothing serious, but figured I should get it checked." Samantha nodded, motioning toward an empty exam room. "Let's take a look." He followed her inside, his gait steady, but with the faint stiffness of someone who had seen a lifetime of wear. As he sat on the hospital bed, she pulled on a pair of gloves, carefully unwrapping the bandage. The cut wasn't deep, but it was jagged and needed stitches. "How long ago did this happen?" she asked, inspecting the wound. Clint chuckled softly, his voice carrying a dry humor. "A few hours ago. Stubborn thing wouldn't stop bleeding." She smirked, grabbing antiseptic. "Well, you're in the right place. I'll stitch you up and you'll be good as new." He watched her work, his gaze quiet but intent. "You do this often?" Samantha glanced up, arching an eyebrow. "It's kind of the job." Clint smirked, shaking his head slightly. "No, I mean, night shifts. Tough gig. Not everyone can handle it." Samantha shrugged, masking her exhaustion with a practiced smile. "Someone's got to do it." Little did she know, Clint had already noticed more about her than she realized. Samantha worked in silence, carefully stitching Clint's wound with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the small exam room, mingling with the quiet hum of machines. She could feel Clint's eyes on her, not just watching her hands, but studying her, like he was piecing together a story only he could see. "You always work nights?" he asked casually, breaking the silence. Samantha hesitated for a second but nodded. "Most of the time, pays a little better, and it works with my schedule." "Tough schedule," he prompted. She exhaled softly, adjusting her grip on the sutures. There was no point in hiding the truth. Nurses didn't get rich. and single mothers had little room for luxury. "Yeah," she admitted, keeping her tone even. "I've got a 7-year-old son, Jake. He's at home sleeping right now. My neighbor watches him when I work late." Clint nodded slowly, as if filing that detail away. "That's a lot on your plate." Samantha shrugged. "It is. But that's life." She didn't add how exhausting it was, how some nights she came home too tired to even change out of her scrubs before collapsing onto the couch. She didn't mention that her rent was always just a little behind, or that medical school had once been a dream, one she had abandoned when her ex-husband walked out, leaving her to figure things out alone. But Clint wasn't just asking out of politeness, he was listening. His eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. "You ever think about going back to school?" he asked. Samantha laughed softly, shaking her head. "I used to, but life had other plans." She finished the last stitch and cut the thread, placing a fresh bandage over the wound. "You're all set," she said, stepping back. Clint flexed his fingers slightly, testing the stitches. "You're good at what you do." There was something in his tone, something deeper than just a compliment. Samantha offered a small smile. "Thanks, it's not much, but it pays the bills." Clint held her gaze for a moment longer. "You're wrong about that," he said finally. "What you do? It's more than not much. It's everything." Samantha blinked, caught off guard by his sincerity. She had no idea that this conversation, this ordinary moment, was about to change everything. Clint flexed his fingers slightly, testing the stitches, but his attention wasn't on the wound anymore. It was on Samantha. She moved efficiently, already cleaning up the supplies and preparing for her next patient, but he could see the weight she carried. It wasn't just exhaustion from the shift. It was the kind that settled into a person's bones after years of doing everything alone. He'd met plenty of strong people in his lifetime, fighters, survivors, but there was something about Samantha that struck him differently. She reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. Maybe it was the quiet resilience in her eyes, the way she pushed forward without complaint, without expecting anything in return. "You remind me of someone," Clint said suddenly, watching as she tossed the used gauze into the trash. Samantha raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "Hopefully, someone good," she said lightly, though a hint of curiosity flickered in her expression. Clint smirked, tilting his head. "One of the best." The room fell into a brief silence, and for the first time in years, Clint wasn't just another celebrity in a hospital. He was just a man, sitting across from someone who saw him as a patient, not a legend. He leaned back slightly, glancing around the small ER. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked. "The hours, the stress?" Samantha shrugged, her practiced smile returning. "Every day. But it's the job. Someone has to do it." Clint nodded slowly. "Yeah, but not everyone does it with as much heart as you do." Samantha blinked, a little surprised by the words. Compliments were rare in her world. Patients came and went, and appreciation was usually a hurried thank you at best. She brushed it off with a small laugh, but Clint could see the way her fingers tightened around the counter for just a second. She wasn't used to being noticed. And that was exactly why, in that moment, he decided to do something about it. Samantha finished the last of the paperwork, glancing up as Clint slid off the hospital bed, adjusting his sleeve over the fresh stitches. She had no idea why this interaction had felt different. She had treated countless patients, but something about him had lingered in her mind. Maybe it was the way he saw through her exhaustion, or the way his words had carried an unexpected weight. "You're all set," she said, handing him the discharge papers. "Try not to stress the stitches too much. No heavy lifting for at least a few days." Clint smirked. "Guess I'll have to cancel my rodeo plans." Samantha chuckled, shaking her head. "You'll survive." Clint took the papers but then paused, reaching into his pocket. At first, Samantha assumed he was pulling out cash for a tip, something she was prepared to politely refuse, but instead he pulled out a folded note and a small envelope, setting them on the counter between them. "Read it when you get a moment," he said simply, his tone even, but something about it felt heavier than casual conversation. Samantha hesitated, her fingers brushing against the paper. "What is this?" Clint met her gaze, and for the first time that night his expression softened. "Just a small thank you." Before she could protest, he gave her a final nod, tipped his hat and turned toward the exit. She watched as he walked through the automatic doors, disappearing into the cold Montana night. For a moment she just stood there, staring at the note in her hand, her pulse suddenly quickening. Something told her this wasn't just a thank you card. It wasn't until an hour later, after her shift had ended and she sat in the dimly lit break room, that she finally unfolded the letter. "Dear Samantha, I don't know your full story, but I know resilience when I see it. You remind me of someone who once taught me that strength isn't about what you endure, it's about how you keep going despite it. People like you deserve to be seen." Her breath caught as a second piece of paper slipped onto her lap, a check for $10,000. Her hands shook. This couldn't be real. But it was, and it was about to change everything. Samantha stared at the check, her fingers trembling as she traced the inked numbers. $10,000. It didn't feel real. She blinked, half expecting the numbers to shift, to reveal some kind of mistake. But there it was. A sum of money that could change her life in an instant. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just money. It was a recognition, a validation, an acknowledgement that someone had truly seen her for the first time in years. Not just as another overworked nurse, not just as a struggling single mom, but as a person who had fought, endured, and kept moving forward. She exhaled sharply, leaning back against the break room chair, her mind racing. What did she do to deserve this? Why her? Of all the people Clint Eastwood had surely encountered in his life, why had he chosen to help her? Doubt crept in. Was she even worthy of this kind of generosity? She thought about the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen counter, the shoes her son had outgrown but still wore because there wasn't enough money for a new pair. The exhaustion of working double shifts, of sacrificing everything to give Jake a decent life, and yet, she had never expected a handout. Tears stung the corners of her eyes as she reread the note, her heart clenching at the final words. "People like you deserve to be seen." A choked laugh escaped her lips. Hadn't she spent the last few years feeling invisible, like the world only noticed her when she made a mistake, when she was late on rent, when she was struggling? She could hear Maggie's voice in her head, the only person who had ever told her she deserved more than just survival. Maybe, just maybe, Clint had seen the same thing in her that Maggie had always believed in. Clutching the check, Samantha wiped her tears. This wasn't just money, it was a choice. And now she had to decide what to do with it. The check felt heavier than paper should. Samantha sat at her small kitchen table, the dim glow of the overhead light casting shadows across the clutter of unpaid bills, medical textbooks she hadn't opened in years, and Jake's half-finished schoolwork. The number on the check stared back at her, a lifeline she never saw coming. She could pay off months of rent, finally replace the worn-out shoes Jake still insisted fit just fine, or fix the car that rattled every time she started it. But as much as those things mattered, something deeper pulled at her. The dream she had buried years ago. Medical school. Her heart pounded at the thought. She had let it go so long ago, convinced that survival was all she had time for. Being a nurse had been the next best thing, but deep down she had always known she wanted to do more. She picked up her phone, hesitating before dialing. "Rosewood University admissions, how can I help you?" a voice answered. Samantha's mouth went dry. She could still back out, still take the safe route. But Clint's words echoed in her mind. "People like you deserve to be seen." She tightened her grip on the phone. "I'd like to ask about your medical program." The conversation felt so real, the application process, the prerequisites, the financial aid options. But by the time she hung up, a new feeling settled in her chest. Hope. Later that evening, she sat on the couch with Jake curled up beside her, his small body warm against hers. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked sleepily, sensing the shift in her. She smiled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Yeah, buddy, I think I'm going back to school." His sleepy eyes widened. "To be a doctor?" She nodded. "Yeah, to be a doctor. Jake grinned before drifting off to sleep, and Samantha let herself breathe for the first time in years. She wasn't just taking Clint's gift, she was choosing to believe in herself. Samantha's decision to pursue medical school wasn't just a turning point for her, it sparked something bigger. Inspired by Clint's generosity, she began to pay it forward in small ways, knowing firsthand how much a single act of kindness could change a life. She started small. She covered a struggling nursing student's textbook fees, left anonymous coffee gift cards for her exhausted coworkers, and donated extra supplies to the hospital. It wasn't much, but every gesture carried the same intention Clint had shown her, to remind people that they mattered, that they were seen. Word of Clint's act of kindness spread beyond the hospital. Patients, doctors, and fellow nurses began sharing their own small acts of generosity, creating a quiet but powerful shift in the hospital's atmosphere. More nurses mentored students, patients left thank you notes, and Samantha realized that kindness had a way of multiplying. One evening, a young nurse, overwhelmed after a long shift, found an envelope in her locker. Inside was a handwritten note and a small scholarship fund for her continuing education, signed simply, "From someone who believes in you." Samantha smiled as she walked past, knowing exactly how it felt to be on the receiving end of that kind of hope. Months later, Samantha sat in her first medical school class, her notebook open, her heart full. She had made it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, balancing classes, shifts at the hospital, and raising Jake, but for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was building a future. One evening, after a long shift, she walked through the ER, catching sight of a young nurse, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, filling out paperwork at the reception desk. Samantha saw herself in that moment, the late nights, the doubts, the weight of it all. She paused, then walked over, setting a fresh cup of coffee beside the nurse's hand. The young woman looked up, surprised. "Oh, thank you." Samantha smiled. "You're doing great. Hang in there." The nurse blinked, then nodded slowly, a small smile forming. As Samantha walked away, she felt the weight of Clint's words settle over her once again. People like you deserve to be seen. She had spent years feeling invisible. Now, she had the chance to remind others that they weren't alone. Because sometimes, one act of kindness isn't just a moment. It's the beginning of something far greater. The story of Samantha and Clint Eastwood teaches a profound lesson about the power of kindness, recognition, and believing in oneself. Samantha had spent years working tirelessly, putting others first while barely staying afloat, convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. She had forgotten how to dream, how to believe she was capable of more, until one person noticed her. Clint's unexpected generosity wasn't just about money. It was about seeing her, acknowledging her struggles, and reminding her that she mattered. His belief in her reignited something she had long buried, the courage to chase her dreams again. Beyond Samantha's personal transformation, the story highlights the ripple effect of kindness. One act of generosity inspired her to pay it forward, proving that hope spreads when given the chance. Whether it was a scholarship for a struggling nurse, a cup of coffee after a long shift, or a simple word of encouragement, Samantha learned that small gestures can change lives, just like Clint's did for her. Ultimately, the story reminds us that sometimes all a person needs is to be seen, to be told that they are capable, worthy, and strong enough to build a better future.